14 members of the board of directors sat in that conference room watching me, and not one of them said a word. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the faint creak of leather chairs as people shifted in their seats. My hands were completely steady. I had been waiting for this moment for 7 months, and I was not going to waste it. But let me back up, because you need to understand what it took to get to that room. I spent 22 years in aerospace quality engineering, not the glamorous side of aviation where you shake hands at air shows and smile for cameras. The invisible side, the side where you are the last person standing between a signed certificate and a catastrophic failure at 35,000 feet. I started my career as a line inspector at a regional fabrication shop in Ohio, checking fastener torque specs by hand, learning every call-out in the FAA's airworthiness standards until I could recite them in my sleep. I worked my way up through 3 different companies, earned my designated airworthiness representative credentials, and eventually landed at Meridian Aerospace Components as Director of Quality Assurance. Meridian made structural assemblies for commercial aircraft, not engines, not avionics structural assemblies, wing attachment brackets, fuselage frame connectors, the kind of parts that, if they fail, you do not get a second chance. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest of this story. These were not components where a tolerance deviation meant a warranty claim. These were parts where a tolerance deviation meant investigators picking through a debris field in a cornfield somewhere in Indiana. I took that seriously. I had taken it seriously for 22 years. It was, in every meaningful sense, the core of who I was professionally. When I joined Meridian 6 years ago, the company was solid. The CEO, a man I will call Gerald, had built the business from a small machine shop into a Tier 1 supplier with FAA production approval and 3 major airline customers. Gerald was old school. He demanded documentation for everything, ran quarterly internal audits, whether the FAA required them or not, and he treated the quality department like it was the spine of the whole operation. We had our disagreements, but I respected him. More importantly, I trusted that we were aligned on the fundamental thing that mattered. That changed when his son joined the company. His son's name was Preston. He was 29 years old. He had a business degree from a mid-tier university, 2 years working in sales at a software company, and exactly 0 background in aviation, manufacturing, engineering, or anything remotely connected to aerospace quality systems. I am not exaggerating when I say that when Preston walked into Meridian's facility for the first time as an employee, he did not know the difference between a shim and a bushing. Gerald introduced him as Senior Vice President of Operations with a direct reporting line over my department. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My wife could tell something was wrong just by looking at me. I told her what happened. She asked me if I was going to be okay. I told her I did not know yet. Within the first month, Preston had reorganized 3 workflow processes without consulting engineering, ordered a revision to our supplier qualification checklist that removed 2 verification steps he called redundant, and scheduled a meeting where he told my team that our documentation cycle was way too slow and needed to be streamlined for efficiency. I sat in that meeting and listened to a man who had never held an FAA Form 8000, 130 to 3 inches. His hands explained to 20-year veterans how to run an airworthiness compliance program. I documented every single one of those meetings. I had a habit from early in my career of keeping detailed notes, dates, attendees, exact language used, action items assigned. I kept a dedicated file. At the time, it was just professional discipline. I did not yet know it would become something else entirely. The real trouble started when Meridian won a new contract with a major commercial airline to supply a redesigned version of our primary wing attachment bracket, a structural component that would be installed across an entire new aircraft platform, roughly 800 aircraft over 5 years. The contract value was significant. The certification requirements were intensive. The FAA had assigned a dedicated principal inspector to oversee our production approval documentation for this specific program, a woman I had worked with on a previous certification and trusted completely. Gerald put Preston in charge of the program's budget management and procurement coordination. I retained authority over quality certification and compliance. That division of responsibility was, on paper, reasonable. In practice, it turned into something I did not see coming fast enough. 4 months into the program, I was reviewing incoming inspection reports on the raw titanium stock we were using for the new bracket design. Something did not match. The material certification documents from our supplier showed the correct alloy designation, but the physical test data our incoming inspection team had run on 3 of the 12 lots came back with tensile strength values that were borderline not failing, but sitting right at the edge of the minimum acceptable range in a way that, across a structural fatigue life, could accumulate into a problem. This was exactly the kind of thing our qualification process was designed to catch. I flagged it, placed those 3 lots on hold, and sent a formal non-conformance report to procurement, engineering, and the program office. 2 days later, Preston called me into his office. He was friendly about it. That was the thing I remember most clearly, how casually pleasant his tone was. He told me he had reviewed my non-conformance report and that he thought I was being overly conservative. He told me the supplier had a perfect record with us for 4 years. He told me that putting those lots on hold was going to push the production schedule back by 3 weeks and that the airline customer was already asking questions about delivery. He asked me to consider releasing the hold. I told him I could not do that. The lots needed to go through a formal material review board process before any disposition decision was made. That was not my opinion. That was our FAA-approved quality manual, which was not a suggestion. It was a legally binding document. He smiled and said he appreciated my thoroughness. He told me he would handle it. I did not know what he meant by that until I checked the system 4 days later and found that the hold had been released. The Material Review Board entry showed a disposition of use as is, with an authorization signature. I did not recognize a name from the engineering department that I was fairly certain had not actually convened a review. I went and talked to that engineer directly. He looked uncomfortable. He told me Preston had told him the non-conformance had been resolved at the quality director level, meaning me, and that the MRB entry was just a formality. He had signed it. He had not been told he was authorizing anything substantive. He thought he was closing out paperwork on something I had already approved. I sat at my desk for a long time after that conversation. I pulled up the full paper trail, printed every document, and read through it twice. What Preston had done was not technically sophisticated. It was sloppy, actually. But it had worked because it depended on people assuming that proper process had been followed and not bothering to check. In a busy production environment with a compressed schedule, that assumption is almost always safe. Almost. I put everything in a folder and took it home. I also started doing something I had not done before. I started keeping copies of emails in a personal archive, including a thread from 6 weeks earlier in which Preston had written to our supplier's account manager and asked whether they had any material in inventory that could ship faster, explicitly noting that the current qualification requirements are under internal review and may be revised. The supplier had responded asking for clarification. Preston had never replied. I had been CC'd on the original thread and had not thought much of it at the time. I thought about it now. For the next 2 months I worked. During the day I did my job, ran my audits, managed my team, and said nothing to Preston about what I had found. At night I documented. I cross-referenced material certifications against test data, against MRB records, against production traveler sign-offs. I found 4 additional lots where the disposition record did not hold up to scrutiny. None of the individual issues were dramatic in isolation. Together, they described a systematic pattern. Production schedule pressure was being resolved by quietly removing the friction points in the quality system, and those friction points existed for reasons written in accident investigation reports going back 40 years. My wife asked me one night why I was not sleeping. I told her I was working through something at the office. She looked at me for a moment and then asked me if it was serious. I told her yes. She asked me if I needed a lawyer. I told her I was not sure yet, but probably. I talked to an aviation attorney, not a firm, a single practitioner I had met years ago through an industry association, a man who had spent 15 years with the NTSB before going into private practice. I laid out what I had. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You understand that if this goes where you're describing, you're not just talking about an internal HR issue." I told him I understood. He told me to keep building the file and to be careful about who I trusted inside the company. I was careful. The FAA principal inspector was scheduled for a surveillance audit in the 3rd week of October. This was a routine audit under our production approval, not specifically related to the new bracket program, but any serious non-conformance could trigger a broader investigation. I knew that. Gerald knew that. Preston knew that. 2 weeks before the audit, Preston called a program review meeting. Gerald attended. I attended. Our VP of engineering attended. Preston walked through the production schedule and delivery forecast. And then he shifted his tone slightly and said that he wanted to address what he called some concerns about the quality department's response time on disposition decisions. He said that there had been unnecessary holds placed on material that ultimately met all requirements and that this was creating schedule risk on a flagship program. He looked at me when he said it. Gerald looked at me too. I said, calmly, that every hold I had placed was documented, that every disposition had been processed through the material review board, and that I was happy to walk through any specific case in detail. Preston said that would not be necessary and moved on. That night I sent my attorney a summary of the meeting. He sent back 2 words: keep going. The week before the FAA audit, something shifted. I came in on a Tuesday morning and found that 2 members of my inspection team had been temporarily reassigned to the production floor to address a manpower shortage, a decision made by Preston without my knowledge or approval. I reversed it immediately and sent a written objection to Gerald, copying legal and HR. Gerald called me that afternoon. He was not angry, exactly. He was tired. He told me that Preston was trying to do his job and that I needed to find a way to work with him. I told Gerald that I respected him and that I needed him to understand that what was happening in the quality system on the bracket program was not a personality conflict. I told him I had documentation he needed to see. He said we would talk after the audit. We did not get the chance to talk privately before things came to a head. The FAA audit ran 2 days. On the second day, the principal inspector asked to review the material certification records for the new bracket program. She was thorough. She had been doing this for 18 years and she knew exactly what she was looking for. I sat with her for 4 hours, going through the files. I did not say anything. I was not asked. I answered every question directly and accurately. When she came to the MRB records for the flagged titanium lots, she stopped and looked at the entries for a long time. She asked me who had authorized the use as his dispositions. I told her I had not. She looked at me. I gave her the name of the engineer, whose signature appeared on the forms. She wrote something in her notebook and moved on. That evening, Preston found me in the hallway outside the quality lab. He asked me what I had told the FAA inspector. I told him I had answered her questions honestly. He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, quietly, that I had made a serious mistake and that I should think carefully about whether I wanted to be the person who blew up a $500 million program over what he called paperwork discrepancies. I looked back at him and said I would sleep fine. He walked away. The next morning, Gerald called an emergency meeting. The conference room. Board members present by video call. 2 in person. Gerald, Preston, myself, the VP of Engineering, and the company's outside legal counsel. The principal inspector had issued a preliminary finding the previous afternoon and contacted our PAH accountable manager about potential compliance concerns on the bracket program. Gerald had called the meeting to get ahead of it, as he put it. Preston spoke first. He presented a narrative I had been half expecting but still found extraordinary to hear out loud. According to his account, he had flagged concerns about the quality department's pace of decision-making months ago. He said I had been made aware of the material issues and had been slow to resolve them. He said the MRB entries in question reflected a collaborative process that I had participated in. He said the engineering team had made disposition decisions in good faith based on guidance from my department. He was measured, organized, and completely wrong. When he finished, Gerald looked at me and said he needed me to acknowledge the process failures on my team's side and to commit to a corrective action plan. The implication was clear. Take the blame, accept the correction, protect the program, protect Preston. I looked at Gerald. Then I looked at the board members on the video screen. Then I reached into the folder I had brought with me and I placed a printed document on the table and I said, before we discuss corrective actions, I would like everyone to review this. The first document was the email thread from 6 weeks before the first hold Preston's message to the supplier asking about faster shipping and noting that qualification requirements were under internal review. Under review by whom? He had never explained that to the supplier or to anyone internally because it was not true. He had written it to pressure the supplier to move faster, implying that the qualification gates might disappear. The second document was the actual MRB record with the signature of the engineer who, when I had spoken to him, had been clear that he did not know he was authorizing a material disposition because Preston had told him the quality director had already resolved the issue. The third document was a side-by-side comparison I had prepared over several nights. The titanium test data from our incoming inspection lab versus the certificate of conformance values from the supplier across all 7 flagged lots, with the FAA minimum tensile strength requirements for the alloy designation called out in the bracket design specification. For two of the lots, the actual test data we had measured did not meet the design spec. They had been released to production anyway. Parts made from those lots were currently in our finished goods inventory, certified and ready to ship to the aircraft assembly line. I did not say anything dramatic. I did not raise my voice. I said, I would like the board to understand that this is not a documentation process issue. Two lots of non-conforming material were released to production through a process that involved falsifying the authorization record. Parts manufactured from that material are in our inventory. I notified my attorney before this meeting, and I will be cooperating fully with the FAA's investigation. The room was very quiet. Preston started to say something. One of the outside legal counsel put a hand on the table and he stopped. Gerald looked at the documents for a long time. He looked older than I had ever seen him look. He did not look at Preston. The formal consequences took several months to play out, but they were significant. The FAA issued a production approval hold on the bracket program pending investigation, which froze all shipments and triggered notification requirements to our airline customers. The Department of Justice opened an inquiry under the False Claims Act because the certification documents in question were submitted to an airline that operated aircraft under FAA oversight, making the falsified MRB records potentially federal in nature. Meridian's outside legal counsel negotiated with both agencies simultaneously for 4 months. Preston resigned before any formal action was taken against him personally, but the DOJ inquiry followed him. He ultimately received a deferred prosecution agreement conditioned on 2 years of probation, $180,000 in fines, and a permanent bar from working in any FAA-regulated industry. The engineer whose signature appeared on the falsified MRB records cooperated fully with investigators and received a formal letter of warning rather than prosecution. He had been manipulated, and the record reflected that. Gerald stepped down as CEO. He did not fight it. I think he already knew, somewhere, what had been happening, and the weight of it was not something he wanted to carry into whatever came next for the company. Meridian entered a consent order with the FAA that included mandatory third-party audits for 2 years and a revised organizational structure that removed operational management authority from anyone without technical qualifications, in quality or engineering. The 2 lots of finished parts were quarantined and destroyed. The airline customers were notified. None of the parts had been installed on any aircraft. I stayed. The interim CEO asked me to stay, and I said I would, because the people on my team had done nothing wrong, and because the work still mattered. We spent 3 months rebuilding the quality management system documentation, retraining the production floor on the MRB process, and preparing for the FAA's return surveillance audit. We passed. The production approval hold was lifted. My wife asked me, on the evening after we got the clearance letter, whether it had been worth it, whether the 7 months of late nights and a lawsuit threat and watching a man I had respected for years have his career end in a conference room, whether all of it had been worth it. I thought about the parts that were now destroyed in a quarantine bin instead of installed on a wing somewhere. I thought about the aircraft that those parts would have gone into, and the people who would have boarded those aircraft on ordinary Tuesday mornings, not knowing and not needing to know anything about titanium tensile strength or material review boards, or a young VP who thought production schedules mattered more than airworthiness standards. I told her yes, without any hesitation. Yes, it was worth it. I am still here. I still show up every morning and I still read every non-conformance report that comes across my desk with the same attention I gave the first one I ever wrote, 22 years ago in a small shop in Ohio. Because the job is not about paperwork. The job is a key that somewhere between a material certification and a completed aircraft, there are real people whose lives depend on whether the person responsible for quality takes that responsibility seriously. I have always taken it seriously. I always will. And if you are ever in a position where someone with a title and a family connection tells you that your standards are the problem, document everything, trust your training, and don't blink. The truth has a way of being exactly as heavy as you need it to be at exactly the right moment.